Hello, everyone. Welcome to Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Alex Kasnabish. If you are joining us here for the first time, welcome. If you are a return visitor, welcome back. This is our November edition, and I am here with my partner in crime, AJ Parasram, and we are happy to be talking about your questions about racial injustice, social justice, white supremacy, all that kind of stuff. If you've been with us before, you know how this works. But I will give you a quick overview in case you're looking at this video for the first time and you have no experience. So we take your questions either in real time or in advance via our Google Docs form. We don't read them in advance, and we don't do any kind of special preparation. AJ and I take turns going back and forth. We take turns kicking things off, and then we both respond to each question. So feel free to write something in as we're doing this live if you're so inclined, by all means. Otherwise, keep an eye on that form for next time. I will make a quick note that our December edition of Safe Spaces, our Safe Space, isn't going to go because it falls right in the midst of all that holiday time. So we figure you folks might, be off doing other things. We might be off doing other things. So we will come back together in January. So we'll make that a note on our Facebook event page, but consider this a verbal warning. And we'll see you back in January. So before we get into your questions, I'm going to quickly introduce myself and then pass it over to AJ. But first, I'd like to thank the folks who make all this possible, our very kind hosts and friends at Fernwood Publishing, who basically do all the work of promoting and bottom lining this. Without them, this online event wouldn't be possible. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory in Kichpuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, otherwise known in its colonial name by Halifax, Nova Scotia. So acknowledging collectively our responsibility to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories and to decolonize our lives and our presences here as settlers. So wherever you are, I hope you're working towards those things too. So just really quick, again, my name's Alex Kasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount St. Vincent University, where I'm a professor in sociology and anthropology. AJ, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Alex. Thanks to Fernwood and everyone. I'm a Zapatistas, and I am a professor. I sell my labor for wages here at Dalhousie. And just as I'm saying hello, I just also wanted to flag that myself and Sailaja Krishnamurti are organizing a rally on Saturday, December the 27th, for the 1-year anniversary of the farmer protest, the anti-capitalist farmer protests that have been happening in India for a year now. So if you are so inclined, please come out, show some solidarity to these farmers. It'll be 11:30 a.m. at Victoria Park. Back to you, Alex.
Awesome. Thanks, AJ. And just a quick correction to that. I think you meant to say November, this coming Saturday, right? Not December.
Did I say December? Yes. No, November. Hours.
Yeah. You're time traveling already. All right. So let's get right to it, folks. So again, the way this works is this month it's on me. I'm going to read the questions first and take a first crack at them, and then pass it over to AJ, who's going to take his own crack. So starting with your live questions here. As a recent university graduate now selling my labor for a career in the real world, I'm feeling my radical activist energy drained as each day, month passes of the 9-to-5 grind. How can I avoid such a trajectory and reclaim my passion for dismantling white supremacy, capitalism, and the patriarchy? New job, work less hours, flee to a radical commune? So great question, of course, question that in some ways, I think AJ and I are somewhat experts in, as with so many of our rad friends who continue to make their way through life. Yeah, the struggle is a real one. And I'm obviously just going to speak to this from the perspective of my own experience, but also I guess here I'm drawing a little bit on the work that I've had the privilege of doing with other longtime activists and organizers in my scholarship, and just reflecting on some of the lessons that they pass on, because what you're experiencing right now is in some ways exactly what this world, the status quo, wants you to feel, right? So there's this really super typical narrative. I'm sure you've heard it, and if not, it'll sound very familiar, where, people are allowed to be kind of radical and boundary pushing, experimental in university or college. And then when they age out of that, you get your degree, then you're going to go into your real life afterwards, kind of settle down. And there's that old mantra that people become more conservative as they get older, right? And I think that that's in many ways true. I've certainly seen that happen, but I think the reasons that happens is less to do with age, although, maybe some psychologists might argue there's something about our synapses being less dynamic as we age. I'm sure there's some truth to those things too. But more importantly, you just become more of a, like, I don't want to use this term because I hate to think of myself this way. I'm certainly not calling you this as an insult, but you become more of a regular cog in that big old machine. So when you're a student, you can afford to be kind of outside of, even if you're working, right? Like if you're working for a wage somewhere to pay for your tuition, you're still kind of outside of that big old machine, that industrial capitalist model. But once you're out of that sort of like liminal state of being a student and you're back into it, then you're expected to take on all those other responsibilities, and all those things, whether it's like credit card debt or a mortgage or caregiving for others in your nuclear family, and a little bit beyond that, all that stuff weighs really heavily on all of us, because we don't live in multi-generational households, because we don't live in closely connected communities for the most part, because we are much more atomized and alienated, because most of us, when we're lucky enough to access support for all those things, whether it's like sending your kid to daycare, or having an elder in your life taken care of by, if they need some sort of professional help or more extensive caregiving, all of that stuff is accessed through the market too, right? So you're paying for it. You have to earn the money to pay for it. And that just really has the effect of grinding people down just in a real regular way. Even if you're not working in a coal mine, you're doing a job like me. My job's not, emotionally, or sorry, it's not physically exhausting. Obviously, being a professor is not the most snafu. I'm not sure how it looks on your end, but we are back again. I'm just gonna pick it up from where I was, where my rant was leaving off, and I was just saying that I think the really the biggest piece of advice I would give is to find that group of folks who you like to spend time with and who are politically on side, and you're organizing with around something specific. And don't expect that all the time outside of work time you're going to spend doing awesome, rad political things. You also need all kinds of time to just, rebuild and regenerate yourself. And maybe that means doing non-political stuff. But hanging on to that radical spirit, I think, is a really important thing as you age, as you like get older, but also especially as you're integrated more and more into into just the regular runnings of the capitalist status quo that really do like integrate us and grind us down. So finding those spaces to connect with, where you're often organizing, but just sharing food and sharing time together and sharing each other's company and hopefully enjoying that, and maintaining those connections and keeping them lively. And then, making sure that if you are going to events, that you're not part of organizing, let's say, because you don't have to be leading the show all the time, right? But you're picking things that you find uplifting and important, right? That you're not trying to do everything, and that you're recognizing failing the awesome idea of building a really cool and robust commune, that you're going to have to make some compromises about, your day gig and then your passions around that, but also being like real and gentle with yourself. And when you're feeling burnt out, being able to step away for a bit so you can come back later, and not so it all gets burnt down. Anyway, over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, and sorry for the tech glitch there, folks. It gave me a little bit of time to think about what I wanted to say to this. And there's so many different ways to approach a question like this, because I really do think that everybody experiences this in some shape or form. Whether you're into radical politics, or even if you're into mainstream politics, or even if you're like into sports or something, there's something about the daily grind of life under capitalism, advanced late stage capitalism, that is designed to suck the soul out of you. And I don't say that in ideological terms. I'm trying to be descriptive here. And there's a reason why, right? And I think it helps, especially for those of us who are very deliberate in our politics, it helps to think about how the mode of production that we're all engaged in actually works to pacify our ability and even our desire to engage in transformative politics. Being aware of it, it is a logical first start. You're probably already aware of it because you posed this question. One thing I would suggest, and I have a couple suggestions that I'm going to divide into time frames: short term, medium term, and for the long haul. So, in the short term, I would suggest thinking about your day job or night job, whatever it is. Try to think of it in a research sense to some extent. It's a deep ethnography of life under advanced capitalism. It's not just you. Always remember that kind of like collective emancipatory project that's possible with your colleagues. And I don't mean to, I totally agree with Alex when he said, don't look to make your work about your politics necessarily, because in most cases it just won't be able to. But it doesn't mean that you can't see points of solidarity amongst your fellow workers. And whether that means, getting involved in a union drive or getting involved in your union as like a possible avenue to which to try and negotiate that. Or like, even if you don't have the protection of a union, like maybe like trying to think about how you position and take fights to management or whatnot on behalf of yourself and others. But even if you're just laying low at the job and you're not engaging in politics at the job, treat this as a way to learn through observation about like the realities of life under capitalism at whatever kind of level you're at there. In the medium term, I think study with ideally with other people, is a fantastic way to try and deal with that and find inspiration. And when I say study, I mean it in a broad sense. Like think creatively about ways to deepen your knowledge and your understanding. And it kind of, in this sense, drawing a little bit on social movement theory, it's this idea that even if you're not always engaged at the forefront of the struggle, then you're preparing the ground for what is to come. And you are part of that ground. So part of that study, dealing with others, is to kind of embrace the kind of radical politics of sharing space with others, and that could take so many different forms. That study could be a reading group, is the conventional sense. That study could be, one of the things that I did in the past that I really loved participating in was just forming an anarcho-vegan potluck crew, with people in Ottawa, where I was living at the time. And a lot of us there didn't have capacity. We had the interest, but we didn't have capacity in that moment. But the regenerative aspect of getting together, and, at that time, at times there was like probably 15, 20 people, many of whom were engaged in radical politics, many of whom weren't, many who were students, and conversations and stuff that were continued there turned into projects later on. So you can never kind of discount the generative aspect of really living your politics in the everyday, which comes with the reminder that work isn't your everyday. My partner always says that, let me see if I can get this right. She says that she doesn't love labor. So it's not about having a dream job. You don't dream of labor. That's what she says. I don't dream of labor. And I think it's a really good point. She's shaking her head as if I'm getting it wrong. So I probably quoted wrong, but whatever. You can't hear her, even though she's in the background. So anyway, that's the medium term. And then, of course, yeah, this is related to the long term, which is organizing with your comrades where you find them, preparing the ground so that you can re-engage in a direct way if that's what you want to do. And if not, making it part of your everyday practice. And part of that, again, the last point on every day is the role of self-care, because there's something, I think, inherently transformative about refusing to be exhausted by capitalism, not through fulfilling the mandate of your employer. And, look, I'm going to be real honest here. I'm exhausted every day from work. I have meetings today back to back until 11 p.m. my time. I'm going to pick up my daughter later during a Zoom call meeting that I'm going to have while I'm driving. I'm not saying this as a person who has succeeded in any way, shape, or form to live what I'm suggesting that you do, but I dream of the day when I'm better at organizing my life and my time so that I'm not sort of crushed by these kind of very things that you're speaking to. So it's near and dear to me, and I'm working on it too. So if you have any suggestions too, please send them our way, because I haven't found it, but I do have these ideas about what I think could work. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for that, AJ. Some great reflections there too. And we're always plugging books. I'm sure there's lots of ones we can plug here, but one of the ones I would definitely recommend looking at is a book by our friend and comrade Chris Dixon. I'm sure we've mentioned it before. It's called Another Politics. And in that book, he does a wonderful job. He talks about lots of different things, but one of the things that he talks about in that book is just this question around, how to keep yourself going, how to keep that struggle sustained over the long haul, how to be in it for the long haul. Really great, important question without any easy answers. In any case, on to the next question. Another one from this month. The achievement of collective liberation sounds like a homogenous world of the same culture, values, and beliefs. If not, as history has shown, differences will be the basis for perpetual wars over Earth's finite resources / land. For example, the war between Mexico and the Zapatistas. Should we strive for homogeneity or accept violence as a feature of life? I.e., for example, some Indigenous outlooks on war. So thanks for your question, first of all. I think that you're asking some good and important things here, although I got to say that I think the framing is totally like part of the problem. It's like, first of all, I don't know why, like I use the term collective liberation all the time. And actually it's the farthest thing from homogeneity I can imagine. The reason I like it is because it reminds folks who are not up against the cutting edges of the relations and systems that dominate our world and that degrade the lives of so many people. It reminds them that their lives will get better too. So it's not like white people, for example, or men or settlers giving everything up and then, poor and oppressed people being lifted up while you just sink into the mire. It's actually like, wow, for example, in my relationship with my partner, if I'm less of a patriarchal asshole, then it actually not just makes her life better, but it liberates me from the fucking curse of being a patriarchal asshole, right? Like ontologically, in terms of my being and spirit, it uplifts me, but it also frees me from having to perpetuate all those awful things that demonstrably make me a worse person, but also, bear on my life, right? Like cut out opportunities. For instance, like if I'm less of a patriarchal asshole, then I can have a real emotional, loving relationship with my children. Rather than being like, no, I'm just a stern disciplinarian here to institute, to train my sons into the next generation of patriarchs. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say, like, I would encourage you to think and read and watch things about people's struggles for radical social justice and liberation, because I don't think what you're talking about is actually borne out by most of the histories. Like unless you're talking about like Stalinist, like Russia, in which case Stalin, I'm sure, would have been the last dude to talk about collective liberation. Okay. But there are a whole bunch of struggles that are really beautiful struggles that are about that vision. And just because they didn't achieve it uniformly or universally doesn't mean it's not totally worth striving for. So that's part of the problem with your question. Anthropologically, I'm going to say, I'm just super tired of the idea that somehow humans have always been at war with each other over resources. This is like total, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not trying to be hard. I'm not trying to like demean your question, but we have to be real here, right? Like, so you asked it and you framed it this way, so I'm just engaging it that way. That isn't like the reality of the hundreds of thousands of years that your species has inhabited this planet. The reason you're here today, and I can say this with the full weight of like anthropological knowledge behind me about this, is because you are a small, highly adaptive, problem-solving, communicative, highly social creature in the midst of other creatures like that who are actually willing to cooperate and work together. You would never, your people, your ancestors, I don't care, whether you're like one of these guys who believes that your ancestors were like, you know, cave bear killing warriors or some nonsense like that, you would literally not be here without like your capacity for incredible sociality, cooperation, problem solving. This nonsense about like people always being at war is just, it's born like, I mean, I'm sorry, dude, you're wrong. Like that, it's we're not a species whose history is written in the blood of each other. We're just not. Like violence is certainly a part of us. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like, I am the farthest thing from an apologist for humanity. But so like I just gotta like what I'd say to your question is, first, I take issue with all those, and I would say I take issue almost most strongly with your characterization of what the Zapatistas have done. And like I don't know, it's funny that you would bring that example up. I've lived and worked in Mexico. I spent like a decade working on the Zapatista struggle with other activists who were supportive of the Zapatistas. I can tell you that, yes, the Zapatistas went to war, but very specifically against the Mexican presidency and the army, not against Mexico. And Mexico writ large was never at war with the Zapatistas. In fact, millions and millions of Mexicans marched with the Zapatistas, marched in solidarity with them before they even knew much about their struggle. So, like, once again, the story you're telling is like the question you're asking is a question that's really meant to advance like a very narrow view, a very like, modern, violent, hierarchical, possessive view of humanity that's not actually borne out by the actual anthropology, by our actual histories. These are histories of the powerful you're talking about. So yeah, I would say, like, if you want to see what collective liberation looks like, good on you for picking a really good example. Where are the Zapatistas today? Well, like 25 years after their struggle first emerged, 25 years, a quarter of a century, they're in control of something like a third of the state of Chiapas. They do that mostly peaceably. They still have their standing army, but they haven't been in a shooting war with the Mexican army for decades. They have effectively displaced some of the worst power relations and institutions in their territory, not by violence, not by coercion, but by showing non-Zapatistas that their way of doing things was a better, more efficient, more fair way. And people came to them, used their courts, their justice systems, their ways of governing. They have invited people like me, like all kinds of other internationals, into their territory with open hearts and said, we want to learn from you. We want you to learn from us. We don't want to be the same. You shouldn't try to be us. We don't want you living here. You know, they didn't want a bunch of gringos like me down there, not full time anyway. But I mean, like, this is just all to say that, yeah, like, I would say, while I appreciate the weight of these mythologies as they weigh on us, and it's not your fault that you've absorbed them, because we are literally all inundated with them from the moment we enter. Well, I mean, really before we enter any form of schooling, but certainly after that. Like, the problem is in your question and in the framing. Like, I would encourage you, there are hundreds and hundreds of books about struggles for collective liberation, what I call collective liberation, what other people would call radical social justice, revolution, radical social change, that you can see those histories. Just like there's some amazing books about the histories of the 60s, like George Katsafikis, who's an amazing social movement writer. Read The Political Imagination of the New Left. Like, what a wonderful book that talks all about people's desire for freedom and liberation, but it looked different everywhere it unfolded. Read Vijay Prasad's The Darker Nations, right? The aspirations of people to achieve a non-capitalist, non-state communist vision of the world collectively that had room for the so-called darker nations. Read the amazing work coming out of Indigenous struggles. People like Glenn Coulthard, Red Skin, White Masks, talking about grounded normativity, or when he talks about relations to the land. Like, all these things are different, yet they're all aligned in being anti-patriarchal, anti-settler colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-misogynist, so many things that are bringing them together. But in a world that, as the Zapatistas have said, isn't a homogenous world, but is a world capable of holding many worlds. So, I mean, that's my answer. It's not a binary choice, and it's not a struggle over resources. More than enough here for us to share if the 1% didn't soak it all up and shit their ass back out to us and make us deal with their nonsense. So over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I was going to start with that Zapatista quote about one world in which many worlds are possible. So I'm glad Alex ended there. I think, yeah, the one of the core messages in my response to you is to never strive for homogeneity. Homogeneity, and I'm going to be a little bit, I don't know, academic, I guess, in my answer here. But homogeneity has been, or the quest for homogeneity, universality, however you want to frame it, has been one of the most damaging and violence-inducing quests in the modern age. And by the modern age, I would define that as 1492 onwards in particular. And the reason why, and there's lots of, there's a really interesting, it's kind of like a heavy article called "The Empire of Uniformity" by Barry Hindess and Christine Hilewall from, I want to say, 2002, that looks at Canada here and talks about the project of empire building as this project of trying to make everybody the same. And it does a really good job of looking at that, um, because so I want to speak to some of the word choices you used as well, because I think that they speak to the ontological framing of the question as in the way that I would fully expect anyone to frame this question, right? When you define war and violence, you talked about the quest for resources. And I'm a political scientist by training, international relations. Basically, I study war and violence and all this horrible stuff. But it strikes me too that, like, the way that we teach that, whether it's in history, whether it's in international relations, or what have you, it's always, we want to almost measure human history by these punctuated periods of violence, but we forget about what's in relief there, which is the significant presence of peace, which is more than the absence of war. Peace is about, like, people coming together in solidarity and trying to find ways to live to improve the quality of their lives. Things that we tend to subsume under the rubric of, like, capitalism and ingenuity, and as if like capitalism created the idea of people being passionate and people, like, working hard or something, right? So that's totally, like, not what happened, and yet this is how people in my discipline in particular have historically framed the history of the world. And they've chosen people like Thomas Hobbes, who famously said that life was nasty, brutish, and short, and that, we're always in conflict and we're looking for resources. But kind of building on some of what Alex said, even this idea that people are fighting over resources frames us with a kind of Eurocentric understanding of what land is. Like Alex mentioned Glenn Coulthard. I could mention Doreen Bernard here in Mi'kma'ki has written and articulated a totally different ontological relationship with land and with water in one of her recent articles that we'll put on the reading list. Um, Leanne Simpson, I Am Not a Nation State, Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard together, about place-based solidarity and grounded normativity. What you see when you look at different parts of the world, aside from Europe, and I would include to some extent the rest of the world, not just like Turtle Island here, and Europe there, but like even in other places in the world. I study Sri Lanka, for example. I'm not going to suggest that Sri Lanka was a place that was free from violence. I'll get to that point next. But the ontological framing, the way that people related to land and politics, was organized differently in Sri Lanka prior to colonization than it was during and post colonization. So there's something very particular about the Eurocentric framing of world history as a history of war, that, like South Asian scholars, Indian scholars, have actually picked a date when that happened in India. I think it was like 1822 when a person named Ram Basu wrote the first kind of state-centric history of Bengal for the East India Company, which was a complete, like, it just wasn't at all the way the Indians thought about history. But they realized that the British East India Company couldn't make sense of their understanding of history until they put it into this conflict of war and a story of kings and queens, which is not necessarily how people want to measure history. So there's a Eurocentric kind of intellectual framing that teaches us that history is about war, when the reality is, like Alex was saying, the reason why we're here is because of a sort of unprecedented capacity for love and for support of one another. That's the real story as I see it there. The other thing I wanted to say on this is that violence is a strategy and a tool, not necessarily a condition. So it's not something that, in my opinion, needs to be either vilified or glorified. Violence is something that's not totally unlike, like a shovel, or maybe like the art of learning how to use a shovel. It's something that has a time and a place. People, can disagree with that for sure. I did a short lecture last year that's online somewhere in the ether called Violence and Protest. So those of you who are interested in, I guess, my thoughts on violence and protest, I encourage you to just Google that. Um, and then, yeah, I think the key challenge that your question is getting to, though, is what do we do about conflict? Like, how do we manage conflict? Because that's a super important point that we've never really adequately dealt with. And that is part of what has created the modern condition that seems like war, an endless war. Um, Particularly when we think about the conflict between states and within states. So I think that the key is to really dedicate a lot more time and effort to finding ways to embrace conflict that doesn't have to be universalist in its disposition. Conflict is good. We don't learn anything without conflict. Like learning how to structure our conversations, our engagements with one another so that we can have dignified disagreements is something that's going to have wide wide ranging positive benefits across society. It's, I think, in the best sense of the word, what we academics anyway mean when we defend things like academic freedom. We don't mean, when we defend academic freedom, we're not talking about assholes, refusing to acknowledge somebody's lived experience. That's not what academic freedom is about. Academic freedom is about engaging in a conflictual relationship based on kind of like an appreciation of your opponent, for lack of a better words, intellectual and kind of standpoint position, so that you can have a disagreement and that you can both learn something out of that disagreement. So conflict doesn't have to be just about violence in that kind of destructive form. Yeah. And the last point I would leave there is that this idea of peace is more than the absence of violence. Peace requires like a very active project, and an ethical commitment. And there are sources of intellectual development of peace, particularly from South Asia. It's the area that I know the best. The Jain principle of Amsa, uh, that was embraced by Mohandas Gandhi, another kind of controversial figure, but nonetheless somebody who put and operationalized this idea of, like a local traditional understanding of political theory and put it into practice in a way that had global implications. So peace is a complicated thing. It's not the absence of war. Far from it. It is the presence of actively trying to build a different world, a better world. And that, I would say, also is precisely the project that the Zapatistas have been engaged in since at least 1994, if not earlier. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for that, AJ. I mean, and thank you again for your question. It was like, obviously we dealt with it somewhat conflictually, but and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about those points too. And it's a way of framing the problem that is super common in our society. And again, this is not to like cast any shade on you asking this question. It's like, this is one of the most common narratives. It's like, but how could we? Because things are so, like, life is endless war and it's always competition. And people are like really taught that from a very, very young age. And unlearning that narrative is one of the most challenging things. Letting go of that narrative and accepting the fact that, even if like, the horizon that you're striving towards isn't perfectly possible, that there are multiple other horizons we could be walking towards rather than just this one. Anyway, thank you for that. Let's move on. Okay. The push for equity, diversity, and inclusion has paved way for new projects and positions, opening up for BIPOC folks. But there's some feedback amongst BIPOC folks. Sorry, it's a little bit garbled. But some feedback amongst BIPOC folks is that it's all cosmetic and to project inclusion, and that the reality is vastly different. As a BIPOC professional, how do I reconcile my belief in stepping up and trying to make a difference, while at the same time feeling like an imposter and a poster child for EDI committees? How do we perceive this shift? So I just want to say, like, I think this is a like absolute like $1 million bell ringing question. It's a great question. You are speaking very eloquently to the problems, and in large part to AJ's life right now. I think poor AJ does so much EDIA work at his institution. So I would say, just to start off, that I totally hear you. I am deeply, deeply skeptical to the point of being kind of like, I'd say enraged, but I just don't have the energy for that anymore, at the endless initiatives that the place that I work launches in the name of equity, diversity, and inclusion, most of which have done absolutely nothing to address the way that the university is tied into maintaining dominant power relations and reproducing all of them and serving the interests of the wealthiest and most powerful. And most of which have like don't even redirect significant resources to people, you know? So it's not even doing anything really. It's like at most institutions, hires that would have been done anyway are being done, but in the name of EDIA, so they can say they're hiring people who don't fit, you know, a white supremacist model, but you would have hired people anyway because you need workers here. And, you know, it's like, we've all heard about the labor shortages all across the world right now, but especially across North America. It's like as if some group of, you know, farmers in the Annapolis Valley here in Nova Scotia said, look, we're now we're recipients of EDIA grants because we import foreign workers from Mexico to pick fruits and vegetables in the summertime. And because we exclusively actually hire racialized labor, we are now the best example of an equal opportunity employer, which is obviously ridiculous. Like, you know, they're hiring people precisely because their labor is structurally undervalued and because of the way that racialization works. So I think it's super low-hanging fruit in most, especially in the white collar professions, super problematic. It's used far too much to conscript our time for those of us who are racialized or ambiguously racialized, like I like to call myself, in the midst of the institution to, I don't think it's meant intent. Like, don't get me wrong. I don't think higher ups like administrators think they're intentionally trying to wear us down, but you know, you have to possess a certain kind of mindset to be part of the bureaucracy. And I think they don't think very critically or far or hard about that. I do think that like anti-oppression training, and this may be somewhat controversial, but if you don't know, anti-oppression training, especially in the context of North America, came out of police and armed forces training in the 1970s. Those are the first institutions to be using it, and they used it explicitly because they were worried that racialized soldiers and police officers were basically going to turn on their own institutions. And so how can we find a way, how can we find a type of training that's going to like conscript people, take up their time, make them feel like they're doing something, but actually direct all their energies to bullshit. And so EDIA was born, anti-oppression. And so there's so much of this that goes on in institutions right now, especially in universities. And it flies in universities in large part because it works on this liberal mantra of doing good, of being seen to do good, of being seen to be a good person who cares about this stuff. And so rhetorically, strategically, it flies. I'm not saying it's never done anything good, okay? These policies being in place, even rhetorically, are better than nothing. These people working with a goal of at least acknowledging that these places were misogynist, heteronormative, heterosexist, settler colonial, like racially exclusive places, that's a good thing to acknowledge that. Even if it's shitty liberal kind of characterizing of this stuff, it's still a step forward. I'm middle-aged enough to be compromised enough to see that as a step forward. And I would never sit on that committee though, mainly because I got better things to do with my time. So like I would say both of those things, like we can see the good in it. We can see where some resources were redistributed. We can see where there was benefit without seeing it as the solution we want, which is, I guess, how I'd say, I would suggest that you might want to think about it. It sounds to me like, you know, one of the things that we struggle with is this idea of imposter syndrome. And I would say that that's something that's super hard to deal with. you got to have, I mean, this is one thing in a white supremacist world, in a heteronormative patriarchal settler colonial society. There's so many people who feel like that, I'm not really supposed to be here. I don't really belong. Um, like the way we internalize those relations of oppression is probably the most pernicious thing about them. So don't let, I mean, it's easy for me to say this. I'm not just trying to tell you to be okay, but don't let that narrative characterize your own view of your life. You got your job, you earn that job, you do hard work. Assuming you do work hard, I mean, I don't know. You see, but like, assuming that's true, then you belong there. You deserve to be there, and you don't like. No guilt is necessary around that, right? The sad fact is that we should always see these initiatives as a tacit acknowledgement of the exclusive and oppressive nature of these institutions that continues to this day, but was even more pronounced before. So like some people will try and turn it around and say, oh, EDIA is unfair. It's like special treatment for minorities, No, in fact, this institution has historically been special treatment for people who looks just like, like a middle-class white guy, for example. That doesn't mean middle-class white guys don't deserve to work in these institutions. It simply means that they have belonged to them historically, and that trying to correct that looks like unfairness to them, to some of them, because of that correction. But of course, it's not enough, and it's not far enough, and we could do so much more. But the work of trying to change bureaucratic institutions is incredibly difficult. And we have to remember that those institutions, their primary purpose is actually to reproduce themselves, right? So, and AJ can speak much more to this. I'm going to turn it over to him now, but because he's way more familiar with the gross gears of all this stuff. But I would say that's one of the things. Like, if you find yourself conscripted into these places, decide if you must contribute, decide where you're going to contribute, and make sure you don't get conscripted into every form of tokenistic EDIA work. Do the one thing. Like if you're like, no, I do want to work on this seminar for my colleagues talking about how to, like in an anti-oppressive fashion relate to each other in the workplace. That seems like a good thing to do. I could improve the day-to-day relations in my workplace, but I'm not going to sit on the 12 committees they're asking me to, because that's like going to totally waste my time. Anyway, over to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. I do appreciate this question, and it does speak to a lot of what I've been working on. I think inclusion is the sneakiest part of EDIA, that particular thing, because it always presumes that inclusion into a structurally deficient and harmful institution is a good thing. And maybe at some base level, like certainly when I was broke and being rent evicted and like had no prospects anywhere, the idea of simply getting a job definitely was very appealing. But once that kind of like that was because of structural conditions that were totally different, right? But that was poverty. That wasn't about racism and equity and all that other stuff. But it begs the question: is it enough to simply include somebody into a harmful kind of institutional environment? Um, I have worked, it's true, like in a lot of bureaucratic systems. I've worked for the federal government. I've worked in the kind of think tank industry. I've worked in the academy. I've worked in grocery stores. I've worked in, restaurant. The whole like I've had a lot of jobs, most of them bad, and I've learned a lot from them for sure. But in particular on this, the EDIA wasn't something anybody was talking about, at least in my work environments, until basically I started this job as a professor about 5 years ago. And some of the things that I've learned about the work, and I do a lot of EDIA work here now, but you really have to be clear about what your terms of engagement are when you're being asked to do this. It's true that like people are kind of desperate to kind of like just go to the person who looks different, which is itself an expression of power, because different from what means like the white middle-aged man, like Alex was saying, and then want to position that person in such a way to do a bunch of work that can hang on a shelf somewhere, and then that's just soul crushing. And I've done a lot of that work, to be honest, and it's one of the reasons why I refuse to do that kind of work right now. So you know I actually think that being super clear about what your expectations are can even inspire your colleagues from time to time to want to step up their game. So, for example, ask your employer or whoever is asking you to do this EDIA work, are you ready? Are you able to come to terms with the fact that your institution has been systematically invested in structural white supremacy, in heteropatriarchy, in a masculine bias, in a structural conditioning and shaping for able-bodied or mainstream able-bodied people? Can you come to terms with that? Not you, but like, can your employer comes to term with that? Because if they can't right off the bat say, yeah, I'm interested in learning about that, then there's no point in the EDIA work, because the employer, is nowhere near prepared to hear what they need to hear to make any kind of meaningful change. And one of the things that I found somewhat heartening is that in having these very direct conversations, uh, I've been surprised by many of my colleagues who do appear to be able to hear these things, that want to hear these things, in fact. So then you ask your employer, what is it that you're prepared to commit to? What are the resources that you will bring to this work so that I know that I'm not spending my time kind of doing nothing? And that might be, I don't know what your situation is, that might be paying you extra for the time that you're committing to this because it's kind of very difficult, soul crushing work. It might mean, what will you materially kind of bring to the, are you going to like hire more people? Are you going to, how will you change the institutional framework through which you're even conceiving of these questions in the first place? They're kind of big, broad questions in that regard. And then finally, I guess the last thing I would say about this is through being clear about what your expectations and parameters are for the work, it allows you to take agency over the work that you're doing, to set boundaries, to decide when a line has been crossed and you won't go further. And probably employers, I would like to believe, even maybe even in the private sector, who knows, they would respect that level of um, confidence and clarity about what it is that you're trying to do. Keep the work kind of like narrow and specific wherever you can, unless you feel that you want to engage in these broader structural things. But keep in mind that those broader structural abstract projects are actually the easiest things for institutions to say, yes, we commit to that, and then put it on a shelf until 5 years later, when somebody else who looks just like you is going to have to dust off that binder and then flip through the pages and realize, oh shit, like much like the Matrix, we've been through all this before. So that's what you want to avoid. So set parameters that force and coerce, if necessary, action. Set traps if you need to, that kind of like allow you to like exit points, and then just be clear with the employer and be like, listen, if you're not ready for this, you are not ready for this. And I'm not going to waste either of our time doing this. So until you get your shit together, then we can't talk about this. But get your shit together, and then let's talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, or whatever other acronym that you have for me, because there's lots of them going on. So again, I don't mean to sound too cynical. People do lots of good work and stuff, but far more often is that EDIA becomes a mechanism through which to depoliticize and exhaust already overtaxed individuals in the workplace. And in doing so, it sets us all up for failure. It sets us all up to make the institution look like there's nothing wrong with the institution, and that, we should just be grateful recipients of the jobs that we have. And that is a bunch of bullshit. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, very well said. We could have a whole special edition of Safe Space for about EDIA. Anyway, I think we have time for one more question, perhaps, before we wrap up here. So we're actually digging back into the vault here from previous episodes, going back to October. I'm just going to start with the first one here because it seems fair. There was such attention paid to these issues after the murder of George Floyd. It seems to have gone silent again. Do you feel that progress was made with that attention? So obviously, I think the question is referring to issues of police violence and racialized injustice, particularly, the kind of rampant police killing in the United States, and let's not forget Canada and elsewhere, of racialized people, particularly Black people, Indigenous people. This is a great question. And it's hard not to have it on the mind this week as verdicts have come down in both the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally case, and which was a civil case actually, and then in the case of Kyle Rittenhouse too, right? So not police related, but again, issues that or cases that strongly implicate white supremacy, and more than white supremacy, we're talking about white power violence, right? I feel like your question pretty accurately sums up how I feel about it in this particular moment. It's hard not to feel a bit disheartened by what I might characterize, and I think maybe you feel too, in reading between the lines of your question, some of the loss of momentum in the months and the years that have followed. So obviously, for example, there was a big push in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder to defund the police, and that even made it to city councils especially across the United States, where cities were actually debating what to do about this. And nowhere did it really result in anything very concrete. In fact, many people who were supportive backed away from that in the days and months that followed. In some ways, I think I would encourage people not to feel too disheartened by that. I think that is a very predictable response, like AJ was just saying about response from institutions and power holders, where obviously in the immediate aftermath of that brutal murder, right, where that cop held Floyd down for more than 9.5 minutes with a knee on his neck. No institutional figure could come forward and say this was justified. I mean, there was some attempt to do that in the trial, but obviously didn't fly with anybody. So in the immediate aftermath, there's this kind of mea culpa, we're going to do better. And then as time passes and attention moves on to other things in this world that seems so endlessly productive of horror and suffering, people move on, right? And then there is also, and I would give some credence to this too, there's the understandable reluctance to invest in possibilities that seem to leave us more vulnerable. So one of the questions that we get often in our series is, well, what will we do in the absence of police? And I'm not comfortable anymore with my easy, what I used to have sort of as the easy radical response to that. My response to you is, yeah, I get that. I've seen lots of examples of activist justice be really shitty and go sideways and work in really terrible ways that are just as, I won't say just as violent, because cops have guns and they have the right to kill people if they feel threatened. I've never seen an activist do that, but I've seen activists try to ruin people's lives because they think they were doing the right thing. So I get people's worry and frustration around what to do, So I don't think we should feel disheartened. I think this is where I just, I always return to the long arc of struggle. And I'm not going to give you some cliche about how, the arc of history bends towards blah, blah, blah. The arc of history don't bend no particular way. It bends the way people make it bend. It bends according to movement, to struggle. It bends sometimes according to incredibly unpredictable events that open things up. But it bends because people work to make it bend, really. And our struggles for a better world, and I'm speaking expansively here, have resulted in real victories. Sometimes that's hard to see, but when I was a kid in school, it was still super acceptable to use homophobic slurs as a daily occurrence to talk about people, and almost nobody saw a problem with that. I'm 45 years old when I'm talking about grade school. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it happens. So the culture has changed, and that's a little kind of mainstream culture thing. But if you think about the acceptance of trans rights, although hardly unproblematic, the victory for Indigenous peoples and self-governance over years and decades, none of this is solved, none of it is complete, but all of it is better than it once was. And that doesn't mean history moves in a singular way, but it means those struggles yielded real results. Just because they didn't win it all doesn't mean they didn't win. And I think we need to hold on to that in times like these. We need to be absolutely clearly focused on the fact that these struggles will take years, will take decades, sometimes will take longer than our lifetime, and we won't be around to see them come to fruition. But it doesn't mean that we're not contributing to them. It doesn't mean that keeping that push alive isn't what we should be doing. And I think just to wrap up, I would say, don't let if I can say one thing, I think don't measure effect by social media presence right now. Like, if you can tune out more often than not on that stuff, it's a better way of moving forward and remaining committed. One of the things that I think is a really pernicious connection here, and I'd love to talk about this more some other time, is the kind of like the preying on our emotions, the spectacle like effect of social media, and the way that has infiltrated activism and a focus on immediacy, on impact, on effect, on short-term results over long-term grassroots base building structural change, which is often a lot less sexy and a lot harder work and a lot more resilient at the end of the day. And I think, like, you know, if we thought after the murder of Emmett Till, for example, in the 50s in the States, after this poor kid is like tortured and butchered by these white supremacists because supposedly he whistled at a white woman in a store. And if we'd said, because his murders were acquitted at that time, if the people around him had said, if the NAACP had said, oh, well, that just proves like we can't do anything, well, the civil rights movement wouldn't have happened, right? So people said, fuck that. Like, we're going harder, and that's what we need to do. We just, like, it doesn't always mean self-sacrificing more, but it means figuring out, okay, so we are frustrated. Maybe that wasn't effective. Maybe, and I wish some radicals would actually own this, maybe we haven't convinced a lot of people that abolition is the way to go yet, and we have a lot more to do on that. And maybe we have to find other more convincing ways of speaking than talking about the simple abolition. I mean, I'm not saying it's simple for them, but from what people hear, right? When my 80-year-old mom hears, I want to abolish the police, it stops a lot of conversation, right? We need to find other, more genuine, more humane ways of talking that are able to convince people who are not already on side that these things are worth fighting for. And I would just encourage you to think that, but I hear all of what you're saying. Anyway, sorry to push us right to time. AJ, I'm going to turn it over to you, and please answer and then just wrap up. And don't forget, folks, we will see you in January, not in December.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And thanks for this last question. I've been thinking a lot about, what progress is in terms of, the complete and utter disregard for Black life that, states in particular, not the United States, but states as in countries, practice. And I would extend that also to, at least here in continental North America, to the way that Indigenous lives have also been degraded by the state as a particular project of settler colonization. And if we has the murder of yet another Black man, has that stopped the state from engaging in murder of other Black men, of Indigenous people, for that matter? I mean, it hasn't, right? Like, we know that it's continued, but what it has, and this is, I want to choose my words carefully here. I'm not suggesting, like, when George Floyd was gasping for air, I don't think that George Floyd wanted to become a martyr or anything like that. That's not the purpose when we talk about people's lives, and when we emphasize that they matter. He shouldn't have died, and none of these people should have died. And if that is the case, then the work of stopping that falls on those of us in society who don't want to be associated with the society. And there are lots of ways that we can show disassociation, but they have to be material. When I've attended lots of rallies in the years between then and now, one of the things that always struck me was how activists, in particular Black and Indigenous activists, always turn to the crowd and they say, we need you to get more people out for this, in particular white people. But I think the criticism extends to basically all, in particular non-Black and non-Indigenous people. Until everybody stands up and comes out to defend the kind of inherent right of Black lives, of Indigenous lives, the same way that you would if it was your own kid, then I think the state will always be able to rely on the fact that they can wait till the next news cycle rolls around and they don't have to change a damn thing, as we've seen in the structural conditions of, like acquitting white murderers unapologetically because of laws that are grounded in systematic colonial and racial violence. We treat these laws as if they are laws that are kind of like, well, especially in America, in the United States, they talk the people, these right wing people carry around the Constitution in their pocket because they know that the American Constitution was designed by white supremacists for white supremacists, and specifically designed to oppose the kind of rights of Black and Indigenous people. Um, so I think that there has been progress nonetheless, because I've seen it. I've seen it in my classrooms. I've seen it in my interactions. I've seen it on the streets in the time between then and now. It's only been a very short amount of time, but it has opened, I think, a discursive interest in people who may have not been thinking about any of these issues. And it's incumbent on us, much like Alex was saying, to find ways to communicate creatively with these people, to meet them in terms, whether they're our 80-year-old parents or, our wishy-washy liberal friends or who have you, or whoever, to articulate a position that that society is not inherently good, the state is not inherently good, that you shouldn't feel that you have to defend a state or something, or come up with these abstract hypotheticals, that if you believe that Black lives matter, that if you believe that human life is something that's important, that it is incumbent on all of us to kind of do some of that heavy lifting and to engage in it and to do it. And that could be as little as turning up every time, not once or twice, but every time there's a call out. And to show that you're there for the people who are grieving, and the grief is very real from the communities. So anyway, progress, yeah, the opening is there, but whether or not we can force society through a door that society doesn't necessarily want to go through, because society is inherently conservative, that it's inherently kind of patriarchal and nationalistic, it requires action to push society further than it is willing to go. And I think that's the real kind of piece there. So yeah, with that, thank you for your patience. We've gone a little over time. We will not be joining you in December, so our next edition, sorry, will be the last Wednesday of January. So, happy holidays, happy New Year, all that good stuff, and yeah, see you next year.